By the middle of 1943, the Empire of Japan was watching the sky collapse around it. What had once been a domain of triumph, the blue expanse where the Zero had danced gracefully above China, the Coral Sea, and Pearl Harbor, had become a graveyard of smoke and fire. American fighters, faster and stronger, now ruled the heavens. For every Japanese aircraft that climbed into the sunlight, 2 did not return. The legendary A6M-0, the pride of the Imperial Navy, was no longer the hunter. It had become the hunted. In the early years of the war, its light frame and unmatched agility had made it invincible. But war evolves faster than pride. By 1943, the U.S. Navy and Army Air Forces had unleashed a new generation of aircraft. The F-6F Hellcat, F-4U Corsair, and P-47 Thunderbolt, machines of brute strength and raw horsepower. They climbed higher, dove faster, and most of all, they survived hits that would shatter any Japanese plane. To the pilots of Japan, this new reality was suffocating. Dogfights that once ended with elegant looping kills now ended with black smoke and twisted aluminum falling toward the sea. The Japanese Empire still held vast territories, from Burma to the Solomons, but the sky above them no longer belonged to the rising sun. In the factories of Japan, the struggle to recover began. At the Kawanishi Aircraft Company, located in the industrial city of Hyogo, engineers refused to accept defeat. Their offices shook daily from the distant thud of American bombing raids. Windows rattled, power flickered. Yet inside, the designers worked in silence, sketching lines that might restore honor to Japan's air arm. The company's engineers had already built seaplanes for the Imperial Navy, elegant flying boats that could range across the Pacific. But now, in the final years of the war, Kawanishi was tasked with something different, something desperate. The Navy demanded a new fighter, one that could meet the Americans on equal terms, one that could dive and climb like the Hellcat, one that could endure punishment and still fight back. The challenge fell to Shizuo Kikuhara, a quiet man with a sharp mind and a perfectionist's temperament. Alongside him worked Dr. Toshihara Baba, an aerodynamicist who had studied airflow and control under the old imperial universities. Together, they began with a question no one in Japan wanted to face. What had gone wrong? The Zero, they realized, had been a miracle of a different era, a weapon for a war Japan could no longer afford to fight. Its light frame gave it unmatched agility, but left no room for armor or self-sealing fuel tanks. It could dance, but it couldn't survive. Against the thick-skinned American planes, the Zero's wings tore like paper. The Americans had learned to fight at high altitude, where the Zero's engine gasped for air. The answer, they decided, was not to build a faster Zero. It was to build something entirely new. Thus began the design of the Kawanishi N1K2-J Shiden, or Violet Lightning. At first, the project seemed cursed. The Navy had originally demanded a float plane fighter, a bizarre requirement born of Japan's crumbling infrastructure. With so many airfields destroyed, the Navy wanted fighters that could take off from water. The first prototype, the NK-1 Kyofu, flew in 1942. It was graceful in design, but hopeless in reality. Too heavy, too complex, too slow. But Kikuhara and Baba saw potential in its airframe. They stripped away the floats, redesigned the fuselage, and gave it landing gear for land-based operations. The result was astonishing. The new prototype, the NK-1J Shiden, took to the air in 1943. It was powerful, stable, and, most of all, it could fight on equal terms with America's best. The Navy ordered production immediately, but as always, war refused to wait for perfection. The first Shidens whirled off the line with flaws. Their long landing gear legs, necessary to clear the huge propeller, proved fragile and unstable. Pilots cursed them as death traps on rough runways. Kikuhara's team went back to the drawing board. They shortened the fuselage, lowered the wings, redesigned the gear, and replaced the original engine with the Nakajima Homare 21, a 1,990-horsepower beast that could push the fighter past 360 miles per hour. The new variant would be called the NK-12J Shiden-Kai, or Violet Lightning Improved. It was more than improved. It was revolutionary. The Shiden-Kai combined everything Japan had learned and everything it had lacked. Its cockpit was protected by armor, its fuel tanks were self-sealing, its wings carried 420mm Type 99 cannons, enough to shred any American bomber or fighter in a single burst. And most ingeniously, it featured automatic combat flaps, small airfoils that extended automatically during sharp turns, giving the pilot tighter control and smoother maneuverability. Even American engineers would later admit this feature was ahead of its time. In flight, the Shiden-Kai could roll and turn with supernatural ease. Pilots said it felt alive, like a bird that knew your intentions before you did. One test pilot from the 343rd Naval Air Group described it simply: "She moves where you think, not where you push." It was, by every measure, the equal and, in some ways, the superior of the Hellcat and Corsair. But the problem wasn't the machine, it was the calendar. By the time the Shiden-Kai was ready for mass production, the war had already reached Japan's doorstep. B-29s burned cities by night, factories were rubble, skilled mechanics were gone, replaced by students and women working by candlelight. Every new fighter came from a world that no longer existed. Still, Kikuhara and Baba pushed forward. They built jigs from scrap metal, carved molds from wood, and tested components by hand. In one surviving report from 1944, a Kawanishi supervisor wrote, "The bombers come every day. We repair the runway at dawn, test the engine by noon, and bury the dead by nightfall. Tomorrow we build again." It was a line that captured Japan's spirit and its tragedy. Only 415 Shiden-Kai fighters would ever leave the factory floor. The rest of Japan's designs, dozens of experimental prototypes, engines, and weapons would never reach the front. The nation's industry was disintegrating faster than its genius could act. But the engineers kept working. They believed that even if their creation could not save Japan, it could save their honor. "If the war must end," Kikuhara told a young apprentice, "let it end with something beautiful." And so in the final months of 1944, as American carriers closed in on the Philippines and B-29s turned Tokyo into flame, the Violet Lightning was born. Fast, deadly, and tragically too late. It would soon take to the skies, not to win the war, but to remind the world that even in ruin, Japan could still build a masterpiece. The sky was falling, but from its wreckage rose one last flash of brilliance, a violet lightning against the dying light of the empire.
The spring of 1944 in Japan smelled of burning cities and oil. Allied bombers filled the sky by day, and their contrails drifted like white scars across a wounded nation. Yet in the midst of ruin, inside the dimly lit hangars of the Kawanishi Aircraft Company at Hyogo, a miracle of engineering was taking shape. The men who built it called it Shiden-Kai, Violet Lightning Modified. It was not just another fighter, it was an act of defiance. Each rivet, each panel, each instrument was hammered and fitted by hands that worked in the dark, often to the rhythm of distant air raid sirens. The war was lost in everything but spirit, but Japan's engineers had decided that if the empire must fall, it would fall in beauty and brilliance. The N1K2-J Shiden-Kai was the culmination of everything Japan's aeronautical mind had learned and everything it could no longer afford to produce. From the moment it left the drawing board, it was clear. This was no fragile Zero. This was a predator built to survive. At its heart roared the Nakajima Homade 21 engine, an 18-cylinder radial monster, capable of nearly 2,000 horsepower. It gave the Shiden-Kai a top speed of 363 miles per hour, enough to challenge the Hellcat and the Corsair in both climb and dive. The airframe was reinforced with armor plating, the cockpit enclosed by bullet-resistant glass. Self-sealing fuel tanks lined the fuselage, an innovation that had arrived 3 years too late for the Zero's doomed pilots. Yet in the Shiden-Kai's true genius lay in its automatic combat flaps, a feature so advanced that even American engineers would later study it in awe. The system used small air pressure sensors on the wings to extend flaps automatically during high-speed turns. The effect was extraordinary. The aircraft could corner at impossible speeds without losing control. Pilots described the sensation as if the airplane itself were alive, reading their thoughts before they touched the stick. Captain Minoru Genda, the brilliant strategist who had once designed the attack on Pearl Harbor, tested an early Shiden-Kai in 1944. After landing, he told his crew simply, "This is the fighter we have been waiting for." But the fighter had arrived in a country that was already dying. Kawanishi's engineers worked under conditions that no Western factory could have endured. Air raids forced them to scatter their production across mountain valleys and forest shelters. Electricity was rationed. Tools were made from scrap. Aluminum came from melted kitchenware. Every finished airframe was a small miracle, a product of scavenging, improvisation, and stubborn brilliance. One engineer later recalled, "We had no machines left to bend metal, so we bent it by hand. When we ran out of bolts, we shaved wood to fit the holes. We built fighters in the ashes." The first production models of the Shiden-Kai rolled out in early 1944. Their violet-gray skin gleamed faintly under the factory lights, a color chosen not for camouflage, but for symbolism. Violet was the hue of imperial dignity, the lightning strike of heaven's wrath. But there were only a handful. Allied bombing raids destroyed warehouses faster than Kawanishi could fill them. Each aircraft that left the assembly line had to be flown immediately to the front because there was no place left to store it. At the same time, Japan's fuel supply was collapsing. The oil fields of the Dutch East Indies were cut off by American submarines. Even training flights became rare. Pilots learned to fly the Shiden-Kai not in the air, but in the cockpit, memorizing instruments by lamplight. In June 1944, when the first Shiden-Kais were assigned to the newly formed 343rd Naval Air Group, their commander, Captain Genda again, understood both the promise and the futility of their mission. "This plane," he told his men, "can stand with the Americans, but there are too few of them and too few of us." The 343rd, known as Genda's Blade, was made up of the last surviving veterans of Japan's once proud air arm, aces from Midway, the Solomons, and the Marianas. They flew with the grace of men who already knew how the story would end. Despite everything, the Shiden-Kai impressed even its skeptics. Reports from early test flights spoke of astonishing stability, smooth handling, and unmatched roll control. The Type 99 Mark II cannons in its wings were devastatingly accurate. One short burst could saw through an American bomber's fuselage. In simulations against captured Allied planes, the Shiden-Kai could outturn the P-51 Mustang and F-6F Hellcat below 15,000 feet. At higher altitudes, its underpowered engine began to gasp, but in the chaotic low-altitude dogfights that defined the final year of the Pacific War, it was deadly. Even the Americans, when they finally encountered it, noted how the new Japanese fighter no longer falls apart under fire. But what the engineers couldn't fix was time. By late 1944, Japan's air defense network was disintegrating. Runways were cratered, radar systems destroyed, fuel nearly gone. Many Shiden-Kais were lost not to combat, but to lack of resources. Engines that seized after 20 hours, hydraulics that froze, parts never delivered. Still, production continued, driven more by pride than practicality. Every morning, the factory sirens wailed not just to begin the day, but to warn of incoming bombers. Workers would grab their tools in one hand and helmets in the other, racing to underground shelters as explosions thundered overhead. When the all-clear sounded, they climbed back out, swept the rubble aside, and continued building airplanes. Perfection, one engineer whispered to a colleague, is all we have left. By December 1944, only a few hundred Shiden-Kais existed, yet to the men who saw them fly they represented hope, sleek, violet hope in a sky now ruled by silver American bombers. Each time one took off, its engine's deep growl rolled across the valley like thunder. The villagers who watched from below swore that the sky itself seemed to tremble, as if heaven recognized its final warrior taking flight. For a brief, fleeting moment, Japan had produced something that could stand beside the world's best. But as the year turned, the empire was running out of everything except courage. The Shiden-Kai would soon go to war, not to win, but to burn gloriously against impossible odds. It was the perfection of a dying art, lightning forged in a storm that would soon consume its creators.
By 1945, Japan's empire was crumbling like ash between clenched fingers. American bombers owned the sky, and the once proud Imperial Navy had been reduced to ghosts, crippled ships rusting in harbors, half sunk and forgotten. Yet in one corner of Japan's dying air arm, there remained a spark. The 343rd Naval Air Group, commanded by Captain Minoru Genda, was preparing to go to war with a weapon unlike any other in Japan's arsenal, the Kawanishi N1K2-J Shiden-Kai, the Violent Lightning. Genda, a visionary strategist and one of the architects of the Pearl Harbor attack, understood that Japan's final hope lay not in numbers or production, but in skill. His pilots were not boys from the kamikaze squadrons. They were the last surviving aces, veterans of the Coral Sea, Midway, and Rabaul. They were men who had fought for 4 years, who had seen friends die, who knew the sound of defeat and the weight of inevitability. And yet, when the Shiden-Kai arrived at their airfields in Kyushu and the Inland Sea, they felt something strange, a flicker of confidence they hadn't known since 1942. This airplane, Genda told them during his first briefing, is worthy of your courage. Their first mission came on March 19, 1945, when the U.S. Navy launched its massive carrier raids against Kure Naval Base and the airfields of Kyushu. Hundreds of American aircraft, Hellcats, Corsairs, Avengers, and Helldivers swept toward Japan's southern islands, their engines filling the sky with a steady roar that sounded like the end of the world. The 343rd scrambled to meet them. From the runways of Kanoya and Omura, the Shiden-Kais took off one by one, their violet-gray fuselages glinting in the morning sun. The Homade engines thundered, and the fighters climbed into the smoke-streaked heavens. The Japanese pilots had been told the Americans would come in waves, but nothing prepared them for what they saw. The horizon was a wall of silver. Hundreds of American aircraft moved in formation, glinting like a sheet of polished metal. The Shiden-Kais climbed higher, engines straining. At 15,000 feet, they dove into the swarm. The first clash was violent and sudden. Lieutenant Naoshi Kano, one of the group's top aces, spotted a formation of Hellcats circling over the bay. He rolled inverted, dropped behind them, and fired a burst from his 4 20mm cannons. The tracers tore through the sky, and one Hellcat exploded in flames. Another tried to roll away, but the Shiden-Kai's automatic flaps kept Kano tight in the turn. He fired again, another kill. Within minutes, chaos engulfed the sky. The Shiden-Kai proved everything its engineers had promised. It could dive nearly as fast as a Hellcat, climb nearly as quickly as a Mustang, and in a turning fight, it was almost unbeatable. The American pilots, used to dominating the Zero, suddenly found themselves on the defensive. Reports from the U.S. side later described the encounter as a shock. Pilots returning to their carriers claimed they had fought a new Japanese fighter with incredible maneuverability. But victory, even when achieved, came at a terrible price. The 343rd's pilots fought like masters, but they were outnumbered more than 10 to 1. For every Shiden-Kai that rose from the runway, the Americans launched squadrons of replacements. And above it all, the great B-29 bombers continued their grim work, turning cities into firestorms. In one battle near Tokushima, Lieutenant Kane, a 24-year-old ace with over 30 kills, led a small group of Shiden-Kais against a formation of F-6H Hellcats escorting bombers. He shot down 2, then a third before running out of ammunition. Instead of retreating, he rammed an enemy plane head-on, destroying both. The men on the ground saw the 2 aircraft spiral into the sea together, flaming wrecks that vanished beneath the waves. For acts like these, the pilots of Genda's blade became legends, not because they were winning, but because they refused to stop fighting. But behind the heroism was despair. Fuel shortages crippled Japan's ability to keep its fighters airborne. Some Shiden-Kais were grounded for weeks at a time because there was nothing left to fill their tanks. Spare parts were scavenged from wrecks, ammunition was rationed, mechanics worked with tools made from bamboo. In one diary, one pilot wrote, "We can fly once every few days. The Americans fly every hour. When we rise into the air, we rise against the impossible." Every mission was a gamble not against the enemy, but against arithmetic. In April 1945, as the Battle of Okinawa raged to the south, the 343rd was thrown into the storm. Shiden-Kais from Genda's unit intercepted waves of U.S. carrier aircraft striking airfields and convoys around Kyushu. The results were devastating on both sides. On April 12th alone, the 343rd claimed 52 American aircraft destroyed, but at the cost of almost all of their own leaders. The pilots returned from their missions exhausted, faces blackened by gunpowder and oil. Some had bullet holes in their wings, others landed on fumes, engines cuffing dry. One Shiden-Kai returned with a Hellcat's propeller lodged in its wing root. The ground crew simply pried it loose, patched the holes, and sent it back up the next day. Genda's blade was becoming what the Americans called it in their intelligence briefings, the Ghost Squadron. By May 1945, the unit was effectively gone. Most of its aircraft were destroyed on the ground by bombing raids. The survivors were buried under rubble or hidden in caves. When Genda gave the order to disband, only a few Shiden-Kais remained airworthy. The pilots gathered for a final photograph, a dozen men standing beside their battered fighters. Their expressions were calm, almost serene. They knew they had fought as well as any men could. They had proven that Japanese engineering, even in its final days, could still touch perfection. But perfection, they had learned, meant nothing without numbers. In the last days of the war, a few surviving Shiden-Kais flew isolated sorties against American reconnaissance planes and B-29s. Most ended without contact. One aircraft was shot down trying to intercept a formation of Mustangs over Kagoshima. Another ran out of fuel and ditched at sea. When the surrender came on August 15, 1945, the Shiden-Kais that remain sat quietly on the tarmac, silent, gleaming, forgotten. For the men who had flown them, there was pride, but no comfort. They had fought with the best their country could build, and it had not been enough. The violent lightning had flashed across the war's final skies, brilliant, brief, and gone. The war ended not with glory, but with silence. In August 1945, Japan lay in ruins, cities flattened, factories gutted, airfields littered with the twisted remains of aircraft that had once borne the rising sun. Amid that desolation, the victors moved methodically, cataloging the debris of an empire that had tried to master the sky and failed. On the island of Okinawa, among the wrecks and craters, an American inspection team stumbled upon something extraordinary: a single, almost untouched Kawanishi N1K2-J Shiden-Kai, sitting quietly at the edge of an airstrip, Its violet-gray skin faded by salt and sun, but its shape still fierce and elegant. The fighter was intact. No bullet holes, no burn marks, no damage from the fighting that had consumed the island. Its propeller blades gleamed faintly beneath a layer of dust. Inside the cockpit, the gauges were still legible, the seat harnesses still intact. It was as if its pilot had stepped away only moments before Japan surrendered. The discovery astonished the Americans. Most captured Japanese aircraft were barely more than skeletons, charred frames scavenged for parts, or destroyed in desperate kamikaze attacks. But this machine was whole, pristine, almost defiant. It seemed to say, "Look what we could have done if we had time." The aircraft was carefully disassembled, crated, and shipped across the Pacific aboard a U.S. Navy transport. It arrived in California late that year, marked only with a simple stencil, "Japanese fighter, Kawanishi, property of U.S. Navy." From there, it was sent to Naval Air Station, Patuxent River, Maryland, the same testing center that had evaluated the F-6HF Hellcat and F-8 Bearcat. For the American engineers who uncrated it, the sight was mesmerizing. The Shiden-Kai was unlike any Japanese plane they had seen. Its thick, muscular fuselage suggested strength, not fragility. Its landing gear was sturdy, its cockpit well-armored. The engineers gathered around it as if examining an alien artifact. One of them, Lieutenant Commander Eugene "Bud" Rogers, recalled in an interview years later, "We expected a zero in a new paint job. What we found was a fighter built by men who had learned the same lessons we did, the hard way." Over the next few weeks, the U.S. Navy test team worked meticulously to restore the aircraft to flight condition. Japanese labels were translated, controls were marked. The Hamare engine was coaxed back to life. When it finally roared, its deep, throaty note echoed across the airfield. Not the high whine of the Zero, but a baritone growl that sounded unmistakably powerful. The test pilot chosen to fly it was Captain Fred M. Trapnell, one of the Navy's finest evaluators, a man who had flown everything from biplanes to jet prototypes. On a crisp morning in early 1946, he climbed into the cockpit of the Shiden-Kai, settled into the surprisingly spacious seat, and studied the instruments. The ergonomics impressed him. Everything was where it should be, logical, efficient. He pushed the throttle forward. The Hamare engine roared again, and the violet-gray aircraft began to roll. Trapnell lifted off cleanly, the Shiden-Kai climbing faster than he expected. "The controls are light," he later wrote. "Remarkably so. The ailerons are sensitive, the elevator precise. This is no Zero. It feels like a Mustang with the soul of a Spitfire." He tested its limits, rolls, dives, climbs, high G turns. At every point, the Shiden-Kai responded beautifully. The automatic combat flaps worked exactly as designed, deploying seamlessly as he tightened his turns. Even under extreme maneuvering, the aircraft remained stable. Trapnell noted that the Japanese designers had achieved something even American engineers had struggled with: a perfect balance between agility and control. When the test flights ended, the American evaluation report was glowing and quietly heartbreaking. It read, "The Kawanishi N1K2-J exhibits superb handling characteristics, excellent visibility, and advanced aerodynamic control features. Its performance rivals the best Allied fighters of 1945. It is the finest Japanese fighter aircraft tested to date." In other words, it was nearly perfect. But perfection had come too late. As the engineers at Patuxent River studied the Shiden-Kai, they couldn't help but reflect on the irony. The machine they admired was the product of genius forged in desperation, designed and built in a nation that had already run out of oil, steel, and hope. Its craftsmanship was astonishing: hand-riveted panels fitted like clockwork, hydraulic systems ingeniously compact, and weapons harmonized for devastating firepower. Yet behind its elegance lay the tragedy of a country that had tried to fight an industrial war with artistry instead of quantity. While Japan was hand-polishing its masterwork, American factories were producing thousands of Hellcats and Corsairs a month. The Shiden-Kai represented the pinnacle of Japanese aeronautical design, but it also represented the futility of perfection in a war that had become a contest of numbers. One engineer from the test team summarized it bitterly. "They built a masterpiece. We built an industry. That's why we won." In the months that followed, the captured Shiden-Kai made demonstration flights for engineers, officers, and journalists. Each time it left spectators in awe. Some even whispered that if Japan had fielded hundreds of these fighters earlier in the war, the skies over the Pacific might have looked very different. But everyone knew the truth. By 1944, Japan no longer had the factories, the fuel, or the pilots to sustain such a machine. It was a weapon designed for a nation that no longer existed. When the testing program ended, the Shiden-Kai was sent to storage. For a time, it sat beside other captured aircraft, Messerschmitts, Focke-Wulfs, and even a jet-powered Me-262. But among them, it seemed the most haunting. Its violet-gray paint faded, its once bright insignia dulled by dust. Still, even in silence, it exuded presence, the ghost of an empire's last dream. Years later, one of the engineers who had worked on the evaluation visited the storage hangar. Standing before the Shiden-Kai, he rested his hand on its wing and said quietly to a colleague, "They built it too late, but they built it right." The Americans had captured Japan's final masterpiece, not a weapon of victory, but a relic of what could have been. It stood as proof that even in the twilight of defeat, human ingenuity could still reach for perfection. The violet lightning had survived the storm, but it had come too late to change its course.
When the war ended, the oceans fell quiet. The thunder of propellers that had once shaken the Pacific faded into memory. What remained were wrecks, ruins, and relics. Among them, in a hangar thousands of miles from home, sat the captured Kawanishi N1K2-J Shiden-Kai, the Violet Lightning. It had crossed an ocean not as a weapon, but as a question. How could a nation on the verge of annihilation have built something so advanced, so refined, so achingly perfect, and still lost? In the winter of 1946, the engineers at Naval Air Station Patuxent River finished their final reports. The tone was clinical, but between the lines one could feel the awe. Flight handling characteristics, it read, are exceptionally well balanced. Control harmony is excellent. Roll and pitch response superior to any known Japanese design. In the margin, someone had scribbled, "Superb aircraft. Arrived too late to matter." That phrase, "too late to matter," would become the Shiden-Kai's quiet epitaph. For a while, the aircraft lingered in storage, its paint slowly oxidizing, its fabric fading to a dull gray. Around it, the world moved on. Japan was occupied, disarmed, and stripped of its weapons industry. Engineers who had once built warplanes now designed sewing machines, typewriters, and motorcycles. The empire that had dreamed of ruling the skies was now forbidden even to touch them. Yet the spirit that had created the Shiden-Kai did not vanish. Many of Kawanishi's surviving designers would later help form Shinmaiwa Industries, a company that built some of the world's most advanced seaplanes. Others went to Mitsubishi and Nakajima, eventually contributing to Japan's rebirth as a peaceful technological powerhouse. The lessons learned from the Shiden-Kai's aerodynamic design, its automatic flaps, its compact power plant systems, its control responsiveness would echo quietly in civilian aviation for decades to come. The Violet Lightning itself was not forgotten. In 1949, it was moved to the U.S. Navy's aircraft collection, then transferred to the Smithsonian Institution. For years, it sat in storage, unseen,
its wings folded like those of a sleeping bird. When curators finally began restoration decades later, they were astonished at its craftsmanship. Each rivet was hand-placed. The alignment of the fuselage was exact to fractions of a millimeter. Even the internal wiring, hand-tied with silk thread, was a work of art. One historian called it the most perfect machine ever built by a nation at war with itself. And that was the heart of the tragedy. The Shiden-Kai was born not from abundance, but from collapse. It was the product of a country running out of everything but intellect. Engineers designing in bomb shelters, machinists building under candlelight, test pilots taking off from cratered runways. It embodied what Japan's leaders never understood, that technology, no matter how advanced, cannot replace the power of supply, industry, and time. In 1944, Japan had produced barely 16,000 aircraft. America built 96,000 in that same year. For every Homare engine that sputtered off a Kawanishi line, 10 Pratt & Whitneys rolled flawlessly out of American factories. The war had been decided long before the Shiden-Kai ever took flight. And yet, the engineers built it anyway. They built it knowing it could not win the war, only honor it. In Japan, those who had worked on the Shiden-Kai remembered their creation not with bitterness, but with a kind of quiet pride. To them, it represented the best of what their country could achieve when it looked inward instead of outward, when it sought mastery instead of conquest. At post-war reunions, surviving members of the 343rd Naval Air Group, Genda's Blade, spoke of the Shiden-Kai with reverence. They remembered its smooth controls, its strength, its beauty in the air. One veteran said, "It was the first Japanese plane that felt like it would protect you. It fought for us, not just with us." Genda himself survived the war and went on to serve in the Japanese Air Self-Defense Force. When asked years later about the Shiden-Kai, he smiled faintly and said, "It was the best fighter we ever built, but a sword, no matter how sharp, cannot stop a flood." By the 1960s, Japan had risen again, this time as a nation of factories, engineers, and innovation. The irony was unmistakable. The same brilliance that had once built the Shiden-Kai now powered the engines of Japan's post-war miracle. The country that had fallen to ashes by overreaching its ambition became the world's symbol of precision and quality. The lesson had been learned, not written in textbooks, but in the metal skin of a violet-gray fighter that came too late. Today, a single Shiden-Kai stands preserved at the National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C. It rests under bright lights, its wings restored, its paint shining faintly, a shade between silver and indigo. Visitors walk by without always knowing its story. But those who stop, those who look closely, see the elegance of its design, the quiet dignity of craftsmanship born in despair. If you stand before it long enough, you might almost hear the echo of its engine, that deep, resonant growl of the Homare 21, the sound of a nation trying to rise one last time. Historians often describe the Shiden-Kai as the fighter that proved Japan's engineers could match the West. But that misses the deeper truth. The Shiden-Kai did more than match anyone. It proved that brilliance can exist in ruin, that even in the dying breath of an empire, the human desire to create something extraordinary endures. It was not a machine of victory. It was a machine of remembrance, a reminder that technology, in the end, is not about domination. It is about imagination. And imagination, as the engineers of Kawanishi proved, can outlive any war. When the lights dim in the museum and the last visitors leave, the violet lightning stands in silence. Its polished skin reflects the glow of the exit signs, and for a moment, it looks ready to fly again, to leap once more into a sky it can never conquer, but will always belong to. It is perfection, yes, but perfection that arrived after the world had already moved on.